Chefs don't burn out because they work too hard. They burn out because somewhere along the way, they started carrying a kitchen that was never meant to rest on one person's shoulders. The people, the pressure, the standards, the problems. And eventually, the weight becomes heavier than the purpose. Today, we're talking about leadership, burnout, and the legacy we leave behind when we're gone from the kitchen. All that right now on the IncrEDIBLE Discourse.
Holy moly!
So, leadership in the kitchen starts long before anyone gives you a title. It doesn't begin when your name gets printed on the schedule, when you get handed a set of keys, or when somebody decides you're ready to run a shift. Leadership starts the moment you decide whether or not they trust you. That's the real beginning. Not authority, not rank, trust. I've worked with cooks over the years who had all the technical skill in the world, but couldn't lead a team to save their lives. And I've worked with others who weren't the strongest cook in the building, but people would follow them anywhere. The difference was never talent. It was trust. One person demanded respect. The other earned it. And in kitchens, those are two very different things. The challenge is that most of us spend years learning how to cook, but very little time learning how to lead. We learn knife skills. We learn temperatures. We learn timing, organization, sanitation, costing, execution. We spend thousands of hours developing technical ability. And then one day somebody looks at us and says, "Congratulations, now you're in charge." And that's usually where things start getting interesting. Because the better you become, the more responsibility people just hand you. And at first it feels like success, right? You get trusted with inventory and then ordering, then scheduling, then training, then labor, then food costs, then hiring, then guest complaints, then culture. And then suddenly you're responsible for things that have absolutely nothing to do with the reason why you fell in love with cooking in the first place. And for a while, it's exciting, right? It feels like growth. It feels like progress. It feels like all the hard work is finally paying off. But somewhere along the way, something starts to shift. You still show up every day. You still care. You still work hard. But the weight keeps increasing. More problems, more expectations, more people depending on you, more decisions that have to be made before anyone else can move forward. And if you're not careful, you wake up one day and you realize you're carrying far more than you were ever meant to carry alone. And that's where burnout begins. Not with the hours, not with the late nights, not with the double shifts. Burnout begins when responsibility starts growing faster than the purpose. That's the part we don't talk about enough in kitchens. Because chefs are conditioned to believe pressure is the problem, right? We blame the schedule. We blame the staffing. We blame the labor budget. We blame the guests. We blame the owners. And to be fair, yes, all of those things can contribute to burnout. But most chefs, they know how to handle the pressure. We've built entire careers around pressure. Pressure is Friday night service. Pressure is Mother's Day brunch. Pressure is being short 3 cooks and still finding a way to get all the food and tickets out. Pressure isn't new. What hurts is losing connection to why you're carrying it. And that's when burnout starts getting dangerous. Because it doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up quietly. You become a little less patient than you used to be, a little more cynical, a little more reactive. You stop teaching as much. You stop mentoring as much. The things that used to excite you start feeling like obligations. The things you once took pride in start feeling heavy. And the scary part is most chefs don't notice it's happening until they're already way too deep into it. And I've seen it happen over and over again. Good cooks, good leaders, people who genuinely cared about the craft. But they didn't lose their talent, right? They didn't lose their work ethic. They lost their connection. The purpose that once fueled them got buried underneath all the responsibility. And when that happens, leadership starts to change. And it's not for the better. For many chefs, leadership slowly becomes control. They start believing that being responsible means being involved in everything, every decision, every correction, every problem, every conversation, and they convince themselves that if they don't touch it, it won't get done correctly. If they don't monitor it, standards will slip. If they don't carry it, everything falls apart. And at first, that can look like dedication. But a lot of time, it's actually fear. Fear disguised as commitment. Fear disguised as perfectionism. Fear disguised as leadership. And underneath of it all sits one very dangerous belief. If I don't do it, nobody will. The moment that belief takes root, burnout is already on the horizon because no chef can sustainably carry an entire operation alone. Not for months, not for years, and certainly not for an entire career. The chefs who last aren't necessarily the toughest. They're not always the loudest. They're not the ones who can survive the most punishment. They're the ones who learn how to build systems, the ones who develop people, the ones who understand that leadership isn't about becoming indispensable. It's about creating an environment that functions because of the team, not because of one single person. And that's the shift, right? That's the lesson. And that's where leadership becomes sustainable. Because leadership isn't endurance. Leadership is sustainability. Endurance asks, how much can I personally carry? Sustainability asks, how much can this team carry together? One leads to exhaustion and the other leads to longevity. And if you're feeling burned out right now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're failing. It may simply mean you've reached the point where the way that you've been leading can no longer support the weight that you're carrying. And so there was a point in my career where I genuinely believed leadership meant never showing doubt. I thought the job of the chef was to have all the answers, to be the first one in, the last one out, the person who could solve every problem before anyone else even noticed it existed. If somebody called out, I was the cover in the gap. If prep wasn't done, I finished it. If there was a guest issue, I handled it. If a cook made a mistake, I stepped in and I fixed it. I took pride in being the person everyone could rely on. And from the outside, it probably did look like leadership. But from the inside, it was something very different. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was slowly turning myself into the bottleneck for the entire operation. Every decision had to go through me. Every problem required my attention. Every success depended on my involvement. I had convinced myself that carrying everything was proof that I gave a shit. And that if I wasn't exhausted, I wasn't working hard enough. That if I wasn't personally involved in every single outcome, I wasn't doing my job. And kitchens reward that mindset, right? They reward the chef who never sits down, the chef who never stops moving, the chef who answers every call, covers every shift, solves every crisis, and somehow finds a way to keep pushing forward. From the outside, it looks strong, looks committed, it looks admirable. But eventually, the bill comes due. And I remember reaching a point where I was tired in a way that sleep just could not fix. Not physically tired, emotionally and mentally tired. The kind of tired that follows you home at night. The kind that sits next to you on your day off. The kind that makes you short with people you care about and impatient with those you're trying to lead. And the scary part was that nothing catastrophic had happened. There wasn't a single bad service. There wasn't one terrible week. There wasn't some dramatic moment where everything was falling apart. It was the accumulation. Hundreds of small decisions to carry more than I should have. Hundreds of moments where I chose control over trust. Hundreds of opportunities to develop other people that I quietly took back for myself because it felt faster, safer, or easier. And eventually I started feeling something I never expected to feel about cooking: resentment. Not towards the food, not towards the guests, towards the weight, towards the constant responsibility, towards the feeling that everything depended on me. And that's when I realized I had misunderstood leadership entirely. Because leadership isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about building a room where strength is shared. The moment that clicked for me, everything started changing. I began trusting people with more responsibility. I started giving ownership instead of simply just assigning tasks. I stopped measuring my value by how much I personally carried and started measuring it by how much the team could accomplish together. And something interesting happened when that happened. The kitchen didn't fall apart. Standards didn't disappear. People didn't stop caring. They stepped up. Ownership spread. Confidence grew. Problems got solved without me being involved in every single one of them. And for the first time in a long time, I felt lighter, more present, more connected to the work. And looking back now, I can see the lesson clearly, right? I didn't burn out because I worked too much. I burned out because I stopped allowing other people to carry weight with me. I confused control with leadership. I confused exhaustion with commitment. And I confused being needed with being effective. That's why I've come to believe that burnout isn't usually a workload problem. It's a leadership problem. It's what happens when leadership becomes isolation instead of collaboration. When responsibility stops being shared. When trust disappears. When one person tries to carry what was always meant to be carried by the team. And if any of that sounds familiar, it doesn't mean you're failing. It might just mean you've reached the point where your leadership has to evolve. Because the next level isn't about doing more. It's about learning how to build more people around you. And that's not a weakness. That's growth. The interesting thing about burnout is that once you've experienced it a few times, you start noticing patterns. Different restaurants, different teams, different cities, different concepts. But somehow the same frustration keeps showing up. And that's eventually what forced me to look at burnout differently. Because if burnout were simply about hours, every chef would burn out at exactly the same rate. But that's not what happens. We've all worked with cooks who can survive a 70-hour work week and still show up positive and focused and engaged. But we've also worked with people who are emotionally checked out after 45 hours. So clearly, there's something else happening beneath the surface. So, what I've come to believe is that burnout thrives in confusion. Not pressure, confusion. I've worked some incredibly difficult jobs in my career. High-volume restaurants, busy holidays, banquets, staffing shortages, multiple concepts, situations where the workload was genuinely demanding. But even in those environments, people were still willing to push because they understood what they were working toward. Expectations were clear, standards were clear, communication was clear, and people can handle the hard work, right? What they struggle with is uncertainty. One of the fastest ways to create burnout in a kitchen is to create unclear expectations. A cook can't succeed if they don't know what success looks like in the first place. If the standard changes depending on who's managing the shift, people stop trusting the system. If one chef wants something plated one way and another chef wants it plated differently, frustration begins to build. If the target is constantly moving, eventually people stop aiming altogether. And that's not a performance problem. That's a leadership problem. And the same thing happens when standards shift daily, right? Consistency isn't just important for the guest, it's equally as important to the employee. Human beings perform better when they understand the rules of the game. When standards are predictable, people gain confidence. When standards constantly change, people become defensive. Every shift starts feeling like a test that they weren't fucking prepared for. And that stress accumulates. And it's not dramatically, it's quietly. One confusing conversation, one contradictory instruction, one unclear expectation at a time. Then there's accountability. Now, accountability is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot in kitchens, right? Everybody wants accountability until it's time to apply it equally. In struggling kitchens, accountability usually flows in one direction, down. The line cook gets blamed. The prep cook gets blamed. The dishwasher gets blamed. The newest employee gets blamed. But very few people stop and ask whether leadership created the conditions for success in the first place. Were expectations communicated? Was the training adequate? Were the systems functional? Was the workload realistic? Because accountability without ownership from leadership isn't accountability, it's blame. And blame is one of the fastest ways to burn out good people. The moment people feel like they're going to be punished for every little fucking thing, they stop focusing on improving and they start focusing on protection. They stop taking ownership. They stop speaking up. They stop asking questions. Their energy shifts away from growth and towards survival. And that's where fear-based cultures are born, essentially, right? The unfortunate part is that fear often looks productive in the short term. People move faster. They stay quieter. They avoid confrontation. From the outside, it can look like discipline. But fear and discipline are not the same thing. Discipline creates consistency. Fear creates compliance. Discipline builds professionals. Fear builds resentment. I'm starting to sound like fucking Yoda here, right? Anyway, eventually, that resentment starts showing up everywhere. Communication gets worse, trust gets weaker, turnover increases, standards become harder to maintain, and leadership finds itself solving the same problems over and over again every single day. Which brings us to another issue that quietly destroys kitchens: leadership bottlenecks. And this one hits home closer for me because I've also been guilty of this shit. And I know I mentioned this earlier in the episode, right? But if you're a chef in the kitchen, young or old, experienced or new, I cannot emphasize this enough. A leadership bottleneck happens when everything depends on one person. Every question, every decision, every approval, every correction, every solution, everything funnels through the chef. And at first it feels responsible. It feels like leadership. But eventually, the entire operation becomes dependent on a single person being present. And the larger the responsibility becomes, the more exhausted that person gets. It's not sustainable. Because kitchens were never designed to run on heroics. They were designed to run on systems. And somewhere along the way, our industry became obsessed with celebrating heroes. The chef who never takes a day off, the chef who works the longest hours, the chef who saves every service, the chef who carries the entire operation on their back. The problem is that heroics don't scale. A heroic chef can save one bad night, but a great system prevents 10 bad nights from ever even happening. A heroic chef fixes problems. A strong system prevents them. A heroic chef eventually burns out, but a strong system creates longevity. And that's the lesson I wish more people understood earlier in their careers. Great kitchens aren't powered by exhaustion. They're powered by clarity. Clarity of standards, clarity of communication, clarity of expectations, clarity of purpose. Because when people know what's expected, understand why it matters, and trust the people around them, pressure becomes manageable. Ownership increases. Confidence grows. And burnout starts losing its grip. That's when leadership stops feeling like survival and starts becoming sustainable, right? I want to give you something you can use on your very next shift. And that means it's time for your
Quick Fix of the Week.
Think about one problem in your kitchen that continues to keep showing up. Not the biggest problem, not the most expensive problem, just one reoccurring issue that seems to require your attention over and over again. Now ask yourself a different question. Who owns it? Not who does it, but who owns it? Because those are two very different things, right? A lot of leaders delegate tasks, but they never delegate ownership. They assign the work, but every decision, every question, and every problem still comes back to them. The responsibility never actually leaves their shoulders. So, this week, pick one reoccurring issue and give someone ownership of it. Give them the expectation, give them the standard, give them the authority to solve it, and then step back and let them fucking do it. Will they do it the same way you would? Probably not, but that's okay. Because leadership isn't measured by how much you can carry, it's measured by what still works when you're not there. If burnout shows us what's broken, then leadership shows us what's possible. At some point, every chef has to answer a question that has absolutely nothing to do with the food. It's not about what cuisine they want to cook, what restaurant they want to work in, what title they hope they can earn. The real question is what kind of environment they want to create for the people around them. And when I look back at the best leaders that I've worked with throughout my career, something interesting stands out. It wasn't their knife skills, their creativity, or even their ability to handle the pressure. What made them exceptional was their ability to create stability in environments that naturally wanted to become chaotic. Because people knew what was expected of them. They knew where they stood. They knew what success looked like. And that kind of clarity is more powerful than most chefs realize because it removes uncertainty and allows people to focus their energy on performing at their very best. A lot of leaders spend their time trying to motivate people, but motivation is unreliable at best. Some days people show up energized and ready to go, and other days they don't. Great leaders understand that motivation comes and goes, which is why they don't build their kitchens around it. Instead, they build systems and standards that create consistency regardless of how people feel on any day. Monday, I feel good. Tuesday, I don't feel good. But the system fixes that. And that's why sustainable kitchens are built on standards. Not complicated standards or endless rule books, but clear standards that everyone across the board understands. The best kitchens I've ever seen don't have fewer expectations. They have clearer expectations. Somebody took the time to define what good looks like, communicate it effectively, and then reinforced it consistently. There's no guessing. There's no mind reading. There's no hoping people somehow figure shit out along the way. Clarity creates confidence, and confidence creates consistency. The same principle applies to communication. One of the biggest misconceptions in leadership is that communication simply means talking, but it doesn't. Communication means creating understanding, and those are two very different things again. We've all worked for chefs who talked constantly, but communicated very little. Instructions changed every shift. Priorities shifted every day. And expectations were assumed instead of explained. And then when things went wrong, everyone acted surprised, and it was everybody's fault. But strong leaders don't leave understanding to chance. They repeat themselves when necessary. They reinforce standards consistently, and they clarify expectations before any problems occur. They understand that confusion is expensive and that clarity is one of the most valuable things they can provide a team. The longer I've been in this industry, the more I've realized that leadership is less about having all the right answers and more about creating the conditions that allow other people to succeed. That's where repeatable systems come in. Right? Systems don't remove creativity, they protect it. When the fundamentals are stable, people have the freedom to grow, to improve, to contribute. When the fundamentals are chaotic, all of their energy gets spent trying just to simply survive the shift. Every successful kitchen relies on systems that make excellence repeatable. Whether that's prep systems or communication systems, training systems, ordering systems, or accountability systems. They aren't valuable because they're exciting. They're valuable because they remove unnecessary friction. And when friction disappears, performance improves naturally. The same idea applies to training. One of the easiest traps for leaders to fall into is becoming correction machines. Every day turns into a series of fixes, right? We're correcting prep, we're correcting plating, we're correcting communication, we're correcting mistakes, we're correcting behavior. Don't do this better. Cut this way, put this here. The problem is that correction only solves today's problems. Training solves tomorrow's. Great leaders spend less time reacting and more time developing people. They don't just tell somebody what went wrong, they teach them how to get it right. They understand that every correction is an opportunity to build knowledge, confidence, and ownership. And over time, those moments create stronger professionals and eventually future leaders. That's when leadership starts becoming something bigger than operations, and it creates and becomes legacy. The truth is that very few people will remember every dish you ever cooked. Most won't remember the special you ran on a Tuesday 3 years ago, or every garnish you placed on a plate, or every menu revision you worked so hard to perfect. But what they will remember is how they grew under your leadership. They'll remember whether you taught them, whether you challenged them, and whether you believed in them before they believed in themselves. That's the part of leadership that lasts. And I think that's something our industry sometimes forgets. We're so focused on food that we forget food is only part of the job. Professionals don't just cook food, they develop people. Every conversation trains habits. Every correction shapes standards. Every expectation influences culture. Every shift becomes an opportunity to help someone improve. And whether we realize it or not, we're constantly teaching. That's why leadership matters so much. Leadership multiplies. A great recipe can impact a guest for a single night, but a leader can impact a cook for an entire career. The lessons, habits, and standards that leaders pass on continue long after the shift ends. They often influence kitchens and teams that they'll never personally see. And all of this leads me into your pro tip of the week.
Pro tips from the chef's list.
Pay attention to the first question you ask when something goes wrong. Seriously, because that question tells you almost everything you need to know about your leadership. When a plate comes back, when a ticket gets missed, when prep isn't finished, or when a station falls behind, most leaders have an immediate instinct. They ask, who fucked this up? And it's natural, right? It's a natural reaction. It's fast, it feels decisive, it feels like leadership, but most of the time, it's the wrong question. A better question is this: where did the system fail? Because people rarely fail in isolation. Systems fail in patterns. Was the expectation communicated clearly? Was the training adequate? Was the prep list realistic? Was the standard understood? Was the workload manageable? Did the process create the conditions for success? Those questions lead to solutions. Blame rarely does. And here's something practical you can do on your next shift. The next time something goes wrong, resist the urge to immediately focus on who fucked it up. Instead, spend 5 minutes examining the process. Look for the point where the system broke down, and then make one adjustment that reduces the likelihood of that problem happening again tomorrow. That's leadership in action. Because fixing systems builds teams. Fixing blame builds turnover. And the mindset that supports all of this is very simple. Discipline isn't punishment. Discipline is respect. It's respect for the craft, respect for the standard, respect for the people trying to achieve it. When discipline is fair, consistent, and rooted in development rather than fear, people grow. They take ownership. They stay engaged. And eventually they become the kind of leaders who pass those same standards on to everyone else. That's how great kitchens survive. And that's how great leaders leave a legacy. And so today's final thought leads us to this.
Food for thought.
Leadership is one of those things that's easy to misunderstand because most of us were never formally taught how to do it. We learned by watching other chefs, some good, some bad, some inspiring, some that taught us exactly what not to become. And over time, whether we realized it or not, we started building our own definition of what leadership looked like. For a long time, I thought leadership meant being the strongest person in the room, the one with all the answers, the one who could handle the most pressure, the one who could carry all of the weight and not break. But the longer I've been in this industry, the more I've realized that real leadership has very little to do with carrying everything yourself. Real leadership is creating an environment where other people can succeed. It's creating clarity when there's confusion. It's creating stability when there's pressure. And growth when there's uncertainty, right? It's understanding that your value isn't measured by how many problems you can personally solve, but by how many people become capable of solving problems because of your influence. And that's why burnout is such an important conversation here. Because burnout isn't always telling you to quit. Sometimes it's telling you to change, to reassess how you're leading, to reevaluate what you're carrying, to ask whether the systems around you are supporting the people inside them, to reconnect with the reason you started cooking in the first place. And that brings us to the question I want you to sit with. If you stopped cooking tomorrow, what would people remember you for? Your plates? Or your presence? Would they remember the specials that you ran and all the menus you wrote? Or would they remember the standards you upheld and the confidence you built in others and the way you showed up when things got difficult? Because plates disappear. Menus change, restaurants close, but legacy lives in people. It lives in the habits you pass down. the confidence you help build, the standards you refuse to compromise, the lessons that continue showing up in kitchens long after you've moved on. That's the chef within. That's the modern chef's mindset. And that's what lasts. So next time, we're talking about pressure makes plates. Because pressure isn't the exception in professional kitchens, it's the environment. Tickets stack up, timers overlap, people call out, equipment fails, expectations still stay high. And in those moments, pressure doesn't create problems, it exposes them. And we're going to break down why some cooks stay calm when everything starts moving faster, and why others fall apart, and why the difference usually has nothing to do with talent. It's about preparation, systems, habits, and the ability to trust your process when pressure starts building. Because when the heat gets turned up, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on your preparation. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next time. And so if this conversation made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you're subscribed on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're looking for deeper resources, blogs, and downloadable guides that will help you turn these conversations into action, you'll find all of them at theincrediblediscourse.com. Oh, and while you're there, pick up a t-shirt. They're really nice, and they help support the show. Thank you for hanging out with me today. Keep learning, keep cooking, and keep trying to be the best every single day. I'm Mark Grigsby, and I'll see you right here next time on The Incredible Discourse.